Hi, I am Abe Greenwald. I am the executive editor of Commentary magazine. And this panel, we're going to take up more of what's been going on since October 7th. I want to introduce my co-panelists. David Kaufman, to my immediate right, is a columnist and editor at the New York Post. He's a frequent contributor to The Telegraph, The Spectator, Airmail, The Forward, Tablet, and Haaretz. And he's an adjunct fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Ruth Wisse is Harvard Professor Emerita of Yiddish and Comparative Literature, senior fellow at the Tikva Fund, and she's the author of numerous books, including Jews and Power and the memoir Free as a Jew, a personal memoir of national self-liberation. And Ruth is also one of my intellectual heroes. I want to start off broadly and then drill down a little more specifically. The Israeli journalist Haviv Reddick Gur made an interesting point in a lecture. He was talking about the difference between Israeli Jews and American Jews. And he said something that I think bears on this conversation. He made the case that the reason that American Jews are so overrepresented, or historically have been so overrepresented in civil rights issues and black activist causes, is because for American Jews, the liberal dream of an inclusive America has to be true, has to be real, because that means that they're in the right place. In thinking about the idea of a shared legacy, as the program has it, does that ring true? I'll start with you, Ruth. That framing of American Jews and black causes, and what's the complementary side of that, or opposing side of that?
Well, it's certainly true, and it's a good starting point. I would say that what brings us here, though, is not a shared legacy at all, except a shared legacy in America. And I would like to start by saying that my approach to these things is always first, do no harm. And to think that there is some shared legacy that one would want to go back to as it was is a very dangerous idea because of what has been said here before. It lasted till the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was very important for both groups. And then, of course, it completely collapsed because Jews and blacks are politically constituted not only differently, but almost in opposite ways. So liberalism is, in a sense, the one thing that unites them. And interesting that you start there. So this may feel like a digression, but I don't mean it to be at all. The place where I would start is with two really, really important novels of the 19th century. One by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is credited with having enormous impact on American politics and on the abolitionist movement. And it was the second most read book after the Bible in the 19th century in America. And I emphasize after the Bible, okay, but still. Now what she does in Uncle Tom's Cabin as a liberal document, and using the novel wonderfully as that liberal document, is to bring us into an empathetic sort of involvement in the lives of slaves so that we know how human they are, so that we know how painful things are for them when they are oppressed, and how evil the evildoers are. In other words, it's the engagement of our sympathies so that we should know what the Reverend was saying before, that basically we are all alike. And the more that we understand that we're part of this human community together, we are all alike. That was the liberal. Now, she was in conversation with, they were writing to one another, with one of the greatest novelists of all times, and my intellectual hero, George Eliot, who wrote Daniel Deronda out of a very similar impulse. And the illiberal impulse, writing for a British audience primarily, was exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. What she had to do in that novel was to say to her fellow Englishmen, if you want to be liberals, the way to test this out is with the Jews. And what you have to do is let them go. In other words, what you have to understand is that they are a people apart, that they are a separate people. And 20 years before the rise of the Zionist movement, that is the greatest Zionist novel written, because the heroine of the novel has to learn that she can't marry the man whom she adores, Daniel Deronda. He has to marry a Jewish woman. And what's more, he has to go off to the land of Israel. He has to go off to the land of Israel, which is how the book ends, with her accepting the fact that he goes off to the land of Israel. And just one other thing, the most touching moment there is that there's an English family that actually wants to adopt a Jewish girl who is come from the continent, who is really in a refugee status in a way, and the family adores her, and the boy in the family wants to marry her. And the mother of the family says, you know, you could really become like us, one of us. And she says, that is the first cruel thing that you have ever said to me. So you see how interesting this is? So the same liberal goal by these two women who are, you understand, making the case for liberalism of their societies. One does it through all together. Now, you know, we all have to understand each other's humanity, but George Eliot understands that Jews are a people constituted politically, particularly politically, constituted differently from everyone else. Either you call it a tribal religion, or you call it a religious civilization, but it's a nationhood and a religion combined, you know, cannot be separated no matter how many people have tried to separate it and do. This is it. And so it's distinctive. So when we're talking about, so I think when we're talking about our subject here, what we want is to work together towards something. And I think that's how to see it. In other words, these two groups have a tremendous investment in America working as it should, and in the civil rights movement, and in the Civil Rights Act and what it stood for, irrespective of race, color, gender, and all else, right? We have a tremendous investment of that. I think blacks as much as Jews, even though they may not realize it in the same way. So if there's to be any kind of a shared thing, I would say let's work for it as one does here, together in the same political direction, but not thinking of it as some kind of, you know, we owe something to one another particularly. I think that could be very deleterious.
Interesting. Picking up on the idea that both groups are invested in America, I'll turn to you, David. It seems to me that the most prominent left-wing black activist groups that we've seen very active since October 7th and before, I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter, of course, and associated groups, they don't want, actually, what Haviv Rediger describes as American liberal Jews wanting, which is for the inclusive liberal dream of America to be true. It seems there's a desire on the identity left in general now for the liberal dream to be disproven and therefore impossible to achieve. So right there, I think whatever the legacy was, whatever its utility was, however long it lasted, at the moment it seems that they're working at cross purposes.
Yeah, I mean, obviously what we've seen since October 7th is sort of the byproduct of decades and decades and decades of racial ideology, identity politics, woke culture, DEI, affirmative action, and the logical and almost the only outcome of that could have been sort of the repulsion and expulsion of Jews. I mean, at every level within that process, particularly within DEI, which is something that I, as someone who is both Black and Jewish, I don't dismiss DEI. I don't dismiss the idea of the necessity of some sort of racial awareness when it comes to outcomes or to goal posting. But that entire process has basically pitted communities against each other, and every step along that way, Jews have been sort of maligned as sort of the arch nemesis or the arch enemy of sort of the objectives of liberal values or progress. These ideologies work on a system of hierarchies. And it goes back to what we were talking about before, this notion of Jews are white, Jews are oppressors, Jews are colonists. And within that hierarchy, within that sort of strata, the only kind of relationship that Jews and Blacks can really have in that idea is tension, is competition, is aggression towards one another. And I think that sort of has eroded this process. I mean, I don't think that necessarily, like, for instance, when my mother was growing up, my mother who's white, who's Jewish, when she was growing up, I mean, she grew up in a working class immigrant community in upstate New York, in Buffalo, and we spoke about this before. Some of the only, and she had, because she was in a lower immigrant working class community, she was exposed to lots of Black people because those are the people who were in the communities around her. And she understood on many basic levels that there was an economic affinity or adjacency between her journey and the journey of Black people at that time. And also at that time, there wasn't this sense of I exist here in direct I don't know if this is a real word, but adversarialness with the Black community. So there's been this rise of extreme sense of adversaries, that Jews and Blacks are now arch adversaries in the quest for success, progress, position, status, and that in a sense that what October 7th has done is said that we were right, that this sort of tension between Blacks and Jews has revealed itself as actually fact, that Jews are doing this, that Jews are have succeeded where Blacks and have succeeded at the expense of Blacks, are white, and that the only sort of outcome of that can be to basically put Jews down, anti-Semitism, protests, marches and protests through campuses, and I think there's been a timidity, especially amongst Jews. I mean, as a Black person, I've never had any sort of reticence to sort of claim racism in America, and nobody would ever expect me to. But as a Jewish person, particularly post-October 7th, there's this inability, or there's a lack of space for Jews to say, we are experiencing anti-Semitism just as dire, just as imperiling as Blacks have experienced racism, and that we demand that we are allowed to say this. Anytime Jews begin to say that we are experiencing this, we're either told that we're taking up space that we don't deserve, or that we are the cause of our own racism or anti-Semitism. And I think that's something that's really sort of unprecedented.
Well, that's something, Ruth, that you've talked about and written about quite a bit, anti-Semitism as the pointed finger and the way it turns Jewish victims into sort of, it claims them as their own victimizers, blames them, and blames them for their own situation, whatever tragedy, the latest tragedy that has befallen them, or the latest attack or the latest massacre. I think, I'm wondering on the question of DEI, whether, I suspect you have a different answer in terms of whether you dismiss it entirely, or if you, as David said, you think You don't dismiss it entirely.
I don't dismiss it entirely, no.
Right.
Well, it's not the way that I look at it, because it doesn't seem to me to be at the center of things. If one is looking at some of the questions that were raised that have to do with what we are confronting at the moment, and basically why we're here, it's because of this monstrous explosion of anti-Semitism in a way that none of us anticipated. You know, I've never done this before, but may I say that I wrote a book, and that was published in 2007, called Jews in Power, and it was addressed at exactly to the question that we're facing here. And I would say that if anybody wants to know what is happening, I can't imagine getting at it at a better way, with all humility. As I say, I'm surprised to hear myself say this, but I think it's just, in any case, here's how I would put it. You know, the Civil Rights Act, when it was enacted, it was the culmination of a very serious process in which we know that's where that Black-Jewish coalition came together, because we had such a stake in it, both of us, in its passage. It passed. But what one didn't recognize is that the same energy that went into the civil rights movement was really energizing an awful lot of other movements at the same time. And those were grievance movements. Grievance movements, as it was said before, against America. Absolutely against America, but the grievance against America and the Jews is really always one and the same. The Jews is longer in some way, but we should understand that. So here, if you see what these grievance movements really are, then you see what an enormity was really building there. One, it's basically what was said by Jamie Kirchhoff and by others. Of course, the communist movement was important in this, is a background. The communist movement and the socialist movement that was around the communist movement had the most astonishing political infrastructure in this country. And let me just say, someone in Yiddish literature, if you know anything, then you know how thickly Jews were involved in the leftism of this country. The first investment that the Soviet Union made in the United States of America's propaganda machine that they had was an investment in the Yiddish daily, the Freiheit, in 1922. And it went all the way into the 50s and so on. So it's huge. So what did they do? This was the economic front. And on the economic front, America was bad because it was capitalist and because it was exploitative, et cetera, so they used every opportunity. And the Jews were the manifestation of that as Jews, but they could rise above it if they became communists. So this was much more dangerous to the Jews than fascism was, because it really said you've got to transcend yourself, you know. And all right. So there was that movement. Then just the black movement was very strong at that point, where you began to have African American voices that said, "Listen, we don't want to blend in. We're for black power. We want to really gain political power as a unit." And then, not to be neglected, and for me, maybe the most important of all, the women's movement, which was turning into a feminist grievance movement, right, against patriarchy. So you have three intersectional, interlocking groups. And one of the things that I would make the claim for anti-Semitism politically as an instrument, it is the greatest coalition builder in human politics. So all these groups are coalescing in that, and then you get, and here's what no one has been talking about yet. This is the key to everything. This is the fact that the Arab League formed in 1945. The Arabs were free of their colonial oppressors, free of their imperialists, free of everything. But the Arab League formed around one thing and one thing only, and that is the organization of politics against the state of Israel. That's the most lopsided war in history, now the longest war in history. Nobody talks about it as that. That's what it is. And so come the Palestinians, who were framed by these Arab leaders to become the perennial claimants to Israel. You can never settle the Palestinians. The Arabs will not allow it. The Egyptians will not allow them into Egypt. The Jordanians will not allow them into Jordan because they have to stay there because otherwise there's no physical claimants to the land of Israel. So one can feel sorry for them, all right, because they've been designated to be these eternally, they have to remain refugees. They have to remain dissatisfied. They have to be killed always because if they're not suffering, then there's no claim against Israel. My point here about America, though, is that all these groups had no flag, had nobody to be against. They had no real enemy. You say, I'm against Wall Street. I saw it at Harvard, you know. But what's Wall Street? It's an abstraction. What's the patriarchy? It's an abstraction. These things. But the Jews are specific. So you have the kafiyah, you have the flag, and you have the real Jews, both in Israel and here and so on. It is monstrous.
I think a very canny point that I've heard you make before in regard to this is that when socialism failed internationally in place after place, country after country, it left the left with no positive model to sort of imitate, and that was the real embrace of grievance, right, instead. Well,
I mean, I don't know. It depends. There may be good socialists in this assembly. I mean, although that's not what brings you here, I'm sure. But I'm not sure that is it. But grievance is, in a sense, to my mind, built into the socialist movement. As a matter of fact, if I may say, I never understood the 10th commandment. The 10th commandment was, for me, a mystery. You know, all the other commandments are specific. But the 10th commandment says that thou shalt not covet. Since when did the commandments tell us how to feel about something? Well, forgive me, but as I now understand it, it means thou shalt not be a socialist.
I want to talk about the idea of anti-Semitism as a great coalition builder. Seems to me something that's happened is that Islamists have been very aware of the potential of the sort of sexiness to the Western left of what they have been up to, and that the outreach from the Islamists overseas, the connections between leftists over here, it's sort of gone in both directions. You had, there was a period during the rise of Black Lives Matter when Palestinians getting arrested would say, I can't breathe, in a sort of symbolic show of solidarity with African Americans. And of course, there's been the, as was mentioned earlier, I don't want to mention too much that was mentioned earlier, but Ta-Nehisi Coates went over to Israel and came back and called the government a Jim Crow regime. So it seems like these ties have been built. And David, something you had said that I saw that I think is an underappreciated point in what's gone on since October 7th is that you said in 2020, Black Lives Matter trained the protesters for this moment. And I think that's true in a number of ways. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I remember during 2020, sort of watching so many Palestinian groups latch on to BLM and sort of claim this movement as their own. And I was actually extremely frustrated, actually quite offended by it. I described it as movement mooching. These people are mooching each other's movements. And for one thing, it's frustrating because it's incredibly lazy and anti-intellectual. It's like, make your own movement, people, number one. Number two, what also felt extremely frustrating to me was that it was sucking the oxygen, part of the oxygen from the room of BLM. I sat there and thought to myself, like, why isn't BLM allowed, whether or not we agree with the objectives and the principles of BLM, but why isn't BLM allowed to have their own movement without Palestinians or the Palestinian cause swooping in to take up some of that space. Like, why does every single movement here necessarily have to latch on to Palestine and to Gaza and to the West Bank? And what's also so frustrating to me was that the way in which so many of these movements, whether it was BLM, whether it was the women's movement, now we're looking so much at gay and lesbian movements, they're literally willing to sacrifice themselves. They're willing to sacrifice their entire movement in order to promote a pro-Palestinian agenda. And that can only go back to anti-Semitism. There's no other explanation for that. And what it also does is that it positions Israel in this very odd place. In one way, Israel is everywhere. Israel is the main focus of every single topic. Israel is the grand overarching enemy that's responsible for everything. So we're sort of blaming and overlaying meaning overlaying cultural and political meaning onto Israel at all times. But at the same time, it erases Israel. It says that Israel doesn't matter. It says that these other agendas matter. So it puts Israel in this position of being, completely responsible for every single peril that's taken over the world, but also erases Israel and denies it any meaning. And what right now, if we look at how that's sort of manifesting itself, particularly not just amongst blacks, but also, of course, amongst gay and lesbian groups, which is also very frustrating. I think what it really does is the goal at all times is to erase October 7th. It's to justify October 7th. It's to say that October 7th was an act of rebellion, was an act of jihad, was an act was legitimate. Every one of these
resistance.
Resistance. Thank you. Every one of these sort of coalition moments is to diminish what happened on October 7th. Is to say that is to promote this idea of genocide. Where if you look at the definition of genocide, what happened on October 7th was the definition of genocide. Jews were hunted down because they were Jews, and they were killed because they were Jews. I actually was at I don't say this very often, I'm not particularly religious, but I was at a Shabbat dinner recently, and a black woman came up to me. I don't know if she was Jewish, and she said something very interesting. She said, even during the height of Jim Crow, and this could be considered a controversial statement, we acknowledge the history and the importance of lynching, but even during the height of Jim Crow, white people didn't want to exterminate black people, but Hamas wants to kill Jews, so it's very different. And I think that part of the problem, why have these sort of alliances, these fake alliances, movement mooching, been allowed to fester so unchallenged? And I hate to say it, but on a certain level, I blame us Jews. We've sat very sort of timid and by the side, and we haven't really demanded that when folks are making these comparisons, well, what do you mean by that? Like you say that blacks and Palestinians have this great shared history of struggle and liberation and resistance. Where? One of the things that I am most proud of as a black person is that the civil rights movement, for the most part, including my own father and my aunt, who were the first to go to non-segregated schools and were hosed down in the process, but the civil rights movement was fundamentally a non-violent movement. Palestinian liberation is defined by violence, it's defined by terror, it's defined by bloodlust. That's not the case of the black civil rights movement. And if anything, to compare them feels quite offensive and it makes my blood boil.
I just want to make one note that you described the Palestinian movement as sort of swooping down on Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was, from its inception,
swooping back.
It was there.
Yeah.
It was anti-Zionist. Yeah. It was already in favor of boycotts. It was right there. It's interesting because you can, if you were to wear a white person were to wear a sombrero, that would maybe be cultural appropriation in the minds of the identity left, but you are welcome to anyone's anti-Semitism, and you can adopt their cause. You can wear the keffiyeh. You can pretend. You can cosplay.
You can buy a watermelon.
One of them.
You can buy a watermelon.
Right. And I think that this speaks to a point that you always make, Ruth, about the political utility of anti-Semitism. It's fundamental political uses, right?
Yes.
And I'm wondering here, because you talk about the different groups involved, David. There's the feminists, there's the LGBTQ groups, and they're all represented on the campuses. They're all out there saying things like "We are Hamas," saying "From the river to the sea," Intifada revolution, and so on. Is there a particular dynamic that can be discerned, or a particular role that can be seen in the Black Lives Matter, or the sort of the black segment of this group, of this
Within
conglomeration itself? Or is it in some sense they're all out there doing the same thing?
No, I mean, it's a good question because every group is different. I want to say that one of the things that I brought that I have never thrown out is, since it was mentioned before, is the article by Skip Gates, by Henry Louis Gates in New York Times. It took up the entire, nobody ever believes me, but they gave him the entire op-ed page. You see this? This is the op, and it was called Black Demagogues and Pseudo-Scholars. And that was the summer before I was going to Harvard. And this made me so happy to be going to Harvard. I thought, oh, this is unbelievable. And what he writes about here is, he says, many Jews are puzzled by the recrudescence of black anti-Semitism in view of the historic alliance, right? Assuming the brutal truth has escaped them that the new anti-Semitism arises not in spite of black-Jewish alliance, but because of it. For precisely such transracial cooperation, epitomized by the historic partnership between blacks and Jews, is what poses the greatest threat to the isolationist movement. And here, what he was talking about here was that this is really, that the black politicians are trying to cultivate a black distinctiveness, a black, and that black movement, Black Lives Matter before that was, you know, Black Power movement, Black is Beautiful movement, which is understandable within a community that's trying to muscle gather its political energies. Mm-hmm. So there is a distinctive element in that. But as to those functions of anti-Semitism, they're all operative in the black community. And I do try to enumerate those functions, one of which I've mentioned is the one that is the biggest coalition builder. Look at the coalition that it's built here in America. But another one of them is, it is the only modern political movement which is entirely negative. Mm. And if you think of our political fight at the moment, and you look at, you know, a healthy democracy has at least two parties, and these two parties engage in negative campaigning. And everybody will say every year, you know, I'm not going to do negative campaigning. I'm just going to do positive campaigning. Well, positive campaigning is very difficult because then you have to stand behind it and so on. But you see that everybody goes into negative campaigning. Do I have to give you the current thing? No, I don't think so. Okay, so you've got the negative campaign. Anti-Semitism was the organization of politics against the Jews in dispersion. Overnight, when the Jews became a people that returned to its homeland, to sovereignty, anti-Zionism became the organization of politics against Jews in their homeland, which was even easier in terms of organizing politics against them. So anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, I'm suggesting that we just call it anti-ism. Mm-hmm. And to call it anti-ism makes the point that people get a lot of energy from negative campaigns. To say what I'm against, it's you know, it is so exhausting these days to be a Jew. And you're right that one should go out there, and the Reverend was right to say we should go out there and talk about, tell them. What are we going to do? We're not proselytizers. So what are we going to do? Tell them how wonderful Judaism is? I mean, yes, fine. It is, but firstly, it's not our DNA. We've not done that. But and here's the gist of it. Why it works is because not only do we not have any incentive for aggression, but we have a disincentive for counter-aggression. So Jews are the one people that it is always easy to be against, profitable to be against, because you're always going to get something by getting what they have or killing them or whatever. And there's never any political price to be paid for it. And this country is not exacting any political price for that, you see? So when you realize all these things, you sort of get scared. One day I was talking to a group like this, and I must say the most moving moment was when I finished. There was a man there who had been very quiet. People were asking all kinds of questions. And at the end, he just said, I heard everything you said, and I do understand, but this is just too pessimistic for me. And it was, you see, and it is extraordinarily difficult to cope with.
The other thing that makes anti-Semitism so useful is its total malleability. You can marshal it, you can sum it up at any point, no matter what the Jews are at a given place or time, you can make that the bad thing.
Sure.
And
As you said, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Did you want to?
I was going to say it's portable.
Portable, yes.
So a lot of this, obviously, of the campus pro-Hamas protests and the campus anti-Semitism has a lot to do with academic, intellectual movements that have instilled all sorts of ideas about post-colonialism and intersectionality and anti-racism. But there's also a reality outside the campuses, in that we know in poll after poll of Americans at large, African Americans are more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than either white Americans or Hispanics are. They tend to be more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause than to Israel. So that's not purely a trickle down or a trickling out of abstruse academic theories, right? This is something else that's still going on. I would like to hear either one or both of you talk about that, because that's a sort of a different. I mean, it's different, it's related, but it's a sort of different set of circumstances, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason is, yes, those data points are very correct and they're very concerning. I think part of the reason is messaging. It goes back to what I was sort of talking about earlier. I think that, again, it also goes back to what you're saying. I mean, Jews have been historically, particularly in the United States, a very accommodating community. We accommodate the folks around us. We want to blend in. We are, for the most part, myself not included, we are, for the most part, white. So we can blend in. And that's not good or bad. I mean, one of the previous conversations was talking a lot about this idea of Jews as white and Jews as people of color. And that always kind of frustrates me, that conversation, because I always think about what are the motivations behind that talking point. Like, even if the reality is most Jews in America are white. My mom is white. She's Ashkenazi. So what? You know what I mean? Even if most Jews in America are white, I don't highly understand the fixation with that talking point. So what? Does that mean they should be slaughtered by Arab terrorists? No. But going back to what I was saying before about, and this talks about the messaging, like about this idea of accommodating. We're constantly accommodating. Like, again, this idea of Jews as being white. Why is this conversation even happening? Why do we allow this conversation?
Well, can I just interject?
Yeah.
Then I would like to hear more of your point. It's in keeping with the political usefulness of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism allows you to accuse the Jew of whatever is hated most in a given society, in a given moment, at a given political moment. And in 2020 and so on, if you were an enemy of the left, by virtue of being white.
Right.
So if you could accuse the Jews of a term that I've heard as hyper-white, actually, Jews, hyper-white.
Yeah, and Ashkenazifization and other types of jargon terms. And it just goes back to what I was saying about the accommodation. Because Jews are an accommodating, cooperative, patriotic community, we've allowed these, we explain ourselves. We try to say things like, well, we're not all white, or da-da-da. My point is, like, the messaging here has not, we've not taken the lead on the messaging, and we've not taken the lead on telling our own stories. You know, so much, we're talking here about how to bridge this divide between blacks and Jews right now, and why there has risen so much anti-Semitism amongst black community. And part of that is because there's this constant effort to, like, harken back to our shared legacies and to the civil rights movement. And that, again, is always sort of frustrates me. Like, again, what is the motivation between trying to go back to history from 50 or 60 years ago, which most young college kids, black college kids, aren't particularly interested in? And if a young 18-year-old wokey black college kid at an Ivy League school heard that a Jew was responsible for establishing the NAACP, or a Jew was responsible for establishing a historically black college, they would probably see that as proof of the overrepresentation of Jews in power, and actually would feed their anti-Semitism. So when I hear that kind of language, for me it's very frustrating, because what I want a young black kid to know when talking about the relationship between Jews and blacks is that whether or not you necessarily believe you have an affinity with Jews, whether or not you necessarily believe that there's a shared community, you have much less in common with Islamic fundamentalists and Hamas terrorists. That's what I want them to know. That, to me, is the most important thing. I don't care if they feel an affinity to me towards a Jew. I want them to know that those people in Gaza are not their friends, and that by aligning with them, they are aligning with a movement that is completely anathema to our views as Americans.
Well put. Mm-hmm.
You had said something about, you said we're not telling our own stories. I wonder, Ruth, is it that Jews are not telling their own stories, or they've gotten used to telling the wrong stories about themselves?
Yes, well,
something that you...
both. I am absolutely, you're right. We've not been telling the right story about ourselves, and I would try very much for a long time, since the 1970s, believe it or not, when the first mention of a Holocaust museum came up in my hometown of Montreal. I was violently against it, and I have been against it ever since. Jews mourn their dead. We are specialists at that. And in Yad Vashem or anything of that kind, that's what we should have done, set up a museum that keeps the record of everything that we can establish. That part of the reverence and the thing, of course we do it. But to come to the United States of America and to tell the story of the success of anti-Semitism and the failure of Jewish political strategy, to bring children, to show them how Jews were killed. I mean, I live a long life, and I try to put myself into other people's positions, and I do understand what they thought was this going to be. But it was an insane idea, pedagogically, and very, very, very harmful, no matter what anyone tells me about the short-range things. Now, I don't want to speak against it, because they're all there, those Holocaust museums, and I realize that you're not going to get people to turn against them. But the way to do it now is to do it the way the Passover story tells it. You do half the museum, it says exactly what happened in the first half of the 1940s. The worst destruction, you can compress it, everything there, the worst. But at that midpoint, you say, now here is the resurrection. Never in human history do you have a case where in the same decade, the people that was so slaughtered and so diminished recovered its sovereignty in the land of Israel that had been under foreign domination for 2,000 years. Nowhere in human history, not in the Bible, nowhere do you have a story of that magnitude. It is astonishing. And think of the black community. I always think of that in particular. Supposing you were told that story in the black community. You say, yes, we were slaves. No, we were less than slaves. in Europe. That was the mistake Jews made. They thought that they would be enslaved. What could be more useful than a slave laborer? So they thought as long as they worked, as long as they were useful, they didn't understand that you were less than slaves. So to be that low, that destructive, but not to tell that story. What the point is that story? Is that supposed to be redemptive? You see, there's something, I understand, and you, if you have thought about this, of course you will understand that in a sense, yes, in Christianity, there's the idea that suffering may be redemptive, and maybe that's a part of human idea, but it is not the Jewish story to begin with. Jews never felt that suffering was redemptive. That is not part of Judaism, right? That suffering was redemptive. And that story, you see, so we have to tell, of course, and absolutely to explain ourselves, but never just explain what we did in Black-Jewish relations. That's, if somebody's interested in that, fine, but that's not our calling card. Right. What we are as a people is what we are as a people in our own right, and we expect others to be. And just one other point that I would make, though, if you're speaking across the aisle, the main point one should make is how bad anti-Semitism is for those who get caught up in it. Because as bad as it is for the Jews, it's worse for those who deflect politics into a politics of blame. There's never been a society that has survived falling prey to their own anti-Semitism. And we forget that the story of Germany, it's not that the Jews were destroyed. The Jews immediately came back. But Germany, let's make this point. Germany was the jewel of Europe. Goethe, Schiller, Brahms, Beethoven, archaeology. You know, when I came to Harvard, I realized the graduate studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, the one foreign language that you had to pass, German. In so many fields, Germany. And now, can anybody speak about Germany like that? Right. They're just trying to make themselves into not being anti-Semitic, right? So if America should fall into this, and you know, the Black community included, but by no means specifically, you know, this country is done for.
I don't want to run over. Oh, yeah, because thank you. So, do we have 5 more minutes to talk, or? Oh, so take questions now. Oh, that's great. We'll take questions now. Is a microphone over there? Yeah.
I can't see.
I'm sitting here. I've been trying to understand sort of the origins of Black anti-Semitism, and I've been sort of thinking about what I've heard this afternoon. And basically, there have been pogroms, been anti-Semitism for 2,000 years, probably more, and except for this brief shining moment when we had a liberal society, small L liberal, which leads me to believe, or at least ask, not believe, but to ask, is Black anti-Semitism really different than other kinds of anti-Semitism? And is this really just an outgrowth of the fact that maybe small L liberal values are not fully integrated within the Black community?
I hear you.
I think all anti-Semitism is basically the same. You know, it's bad and it's virulent and it's toxic. But I think, especially looking at today, I think one of the challenges about what makes Black anti-Semitism unique and sort of special right now is that it's been given a level of oxygen that other communities haven't been given. So it's reported on ad nauseum in the New York Times, for instance. I remember I pay particular attention to these things, being me, so I look at every single article talking about Black and Jewish relations and the rise of supposed Black anti-Semitism. And I think in the New York Times in January, they had 4 massive stories in 1 month about this sort of schism between Blacks and Jews. And so it's a sexy kind of like, you know, jazzy topic that immediately garners lots of page views and hits and likes, and it also speaks to again, it speaks to this idea of a shared history of oppression, a shared history of liberation, and the question, and also which today is not necessarily valid or real. So it isn't necessarily that Black anti-Semitism is different or special than any sort of general anti-Semitism. What Black anti-Semitism has right now is incredibly good branding, and that's working.
That's very well put. Do we have time for another, or is that it? Okay, who's got a question out there? There's a hand back there.
Thank you. I just had a question on messaging. I know you touched on that a bit. I've noticed that Robert Kraft has dedicated a large amount of capital towards eradicating Jewish hate. I do want to know what the solution going forward is with messaging with the Black community. I feel like although there was a lot of capital allocated toward that specific cause for a long time, pre-October 7th, I feel like it hasn't really made inroads with the Black community the way that most people would like to see with that kind of capital allocation. In addition to that, I feel as though the messaging is not sort of aligning with what the Black community values and how they view the world. I think Black people in general in this country view world conflict through personal stories and personal alignment to what they see in their day-to-day lives. And I think it does come back to the conversation of the oppressed versus the oppressor. What do you think is a way to better align the messaging to not showcase an oppressed versus oppressor narrative in the Israel versus Hamas conflict and make better inroads with the Black community going forward?
Is this directed toward anyone in particular?
Yeah, well, in a word, it's not how I would have spent my money, that's for sure. You're the answer to the question. I mean, if you feel that way about that messaging, then obviously it doesn't work. And it may, so you have to draw your own conclusions. But I would say that the message that this group is here to give, and I think that's what the Manhattan Institute stands for, is that this is beneath America. It has really nothing to do with the Black community specifically, except that it has a lot of investment in America. There are a lot of Black people who are dying to come into this country, and it must be because there's something about this country. If this country embraces anti-Semitism, and by the way, let me just say that all the people who are out there in those encampments, what they stand for, in my mind, is rape. They know. They're not blind and they're not stupid. They're for rape, they're for beheading, they're for cruelty that has never been publicized before to this point. Every one of them potentially may be capable of that, as far as I'm concerned. If that's what you are for, and that's what you're demonstrating for, you have to believe that they believe it. And that is a very, talk about what...
At an event at the 92nd Street Y a couple months ago, which I found extremely disturbing. There was an event similar to this, talking about Black-Jewish relations, right after the Super Bowl commercial had come out. And what was very, very concerning was that nowhere in that messaging, talking about anti-Semitism today, did they ever mention the word Israel, Hamas, or Gaza. So they completely skirted around the entire issue. And to me, it felt like sort of a level of Israel erasure. And coming from a Jewish person, that was very, very concerning and worrisome and dangerous, because really this all ties back to Israel. And one last quick thing I will say is that in terms of messaging, how do we express to Black people what this period of anti-Semitism means, why it's important, why it's meaningful? I mean, I would sort of just simply say it like this. Nobody has any problem understanding why I, as a Black man, felt so, why the BLM movement resonated so strongly with me as a Black person. Nobody would question my fear or my concern about being targeted by a police officer in a way that a white man wouldn't be targeted by a police officer. So nobody would ever question my investment or legitimacy to the stakes, to the claims and to the motivations of BLM. But people constantly question, if not undermine, if not deny that same thing when it comes to anti-Semitism, Israel, October 7th. And what I would say is that they're exactly the same thing. For Jews, for Zionistic Jews like myself, for Jews who I've lived for many years in Israel, I've been to Israel, I've been to I've been to the massacre sites. This is as personal for me as a Jew, this moment, as BLM was for me as a black person. Why can't that be understood? Why can't that be embraced? And the question is, for those who refuse to embrace it, why? Why do they refuse to embrace it? Why do they refuse to allow that? And I think that's the messaging I would give, that if we want to talk about a shared experience, for Jews right now, this is our BLM. If not, in some ways, it's even worse because there's a war going on and people died. I think that would be the messaging I would give. It'd be a very personal message. I think that we've been a little bit afraid to be that personal.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well done. Well done.